So you just bought a brand new supercharged jet ski and you're excited. Now all of a sudden you got your buddies telling you that you better get a blow-off valve because if you don't, you're going to screw up your supercharger clutch. Is this BS or is it real? Let's talk about that. Hey everybody, this is Captain Frank and welcome back for another video. I'm glad you can join us again. This time we're going to be talking about blow-off valves. You got a lot of people out there buying supercharged jet skis and a lot of other folks saying you better get a blow-off valve because if you don't, you're going to mess up the clutch on your supercharger. Well, is this really true? Well, it depends. So we're actually going to discuss the ins and outs as to what a blow-off valve does, whether or not you actually do need it or not. One of the big things that people say is, well, if you really need a blow-off valve, why doesn't the manufacturer put one on the ski? Well, there's probably reasons for that as well. But we're going to discuss all those things and what a blow-off valve actually does, and then talk about some reasons why you should need it and some reasons why maybe you actually don't need it. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to actually make a better informed decision as to whether you need to get one for your ski. Okay, so to start, let's talk about exactly what a supercharger does. Going back to the basics of how engines work, we know that in order to get more power, we need to have more air and more fuel. The more air and fuel that we can actually burn inside that engine, the more power that we can get out of that fuel. Now, of course, getting the fuel into the cylinders, that's pretty easy. The fuel injectors do that. But what we have to realize is that there is a specific ratio of fuel and air that gives us the most power as well as the best efficiency. So if we pump more fuel into these cylinders, we also have to get more air into the cylinders. So how do we do that? And that is exactly where a supercharger comes in. So this is a basic drawing of what the intake looks like for an engine. So up here you have the air intake and the supercharger. You can actually see that the supercharger is driven off of the motor. Now, depending on the type of vehicle we're talking about, it could be belt driven, it could be gear driven, whatever. That doesn't really matter. The fact is that the motor is what drives the supercharger. There is a clutch that actually engages when the supercharger is needed, because it's not needed all of the time. It's actually not engaged all of the time. So under normal riding, you're just on your ski, you're going across the water at 30, 35 miles an hour, not that fast. You really don't need the supercharger. The naturally aspirated engine by itself can do that rather easily. So the air comes in the air intake, it goes through a passageway, and then it gets to the throttle plate. Now the throttle plate is actually literally, it's an opening. It opens and closes and allows air to come in either faster or more slowly. The more you pull on that accelerator, the more gas you give it, of course, the more air that the engine's going to need. So the more this plate opens up so that it lets more air in. You let go of the throttle. Of course, less fuel is being put into the engine, and therefore the less air that is going to need to burn that fuel. So that throttle plate actually will start to close. So this is what actually controls that flow of air going into the engine. Like we said earlier, it's the fuel injectors that are going to control how much fuel are going into the motor. So, very, very basic system. Now, let's assume you go in and you give it some gas. You want to go fast. You now need a lot more air going into that engine to go along with the additional fuel that the fuel injectors are going to be putting in. Now we're getting to a point where the motor just sucking air in through the air intake isn't going to be enough. It needs to have air forced into the motor so that you can have enough to match the amount of fuel that's being put into the cylinders. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to this as forced induction. So now this clutch kicks in. So now the motor is actually driving that supercharger. And that supercharger is just like a big air pump, a huge fan, if you will. So now it's forcing air down this pathway into the throttle plate. Since you grabbed that throttle and you pulled it in all the way, that throttle plate is wide open. Now this air is being pushed down through here into the motor, so the motor can actually get enough air to go along with the fuel and give you that extra power that you need. Okay, so now we know how the system works in general, but where does the blow-off valve come in, and how do I know if I still need one? Well, that depends on what type of rider you are. Now, for me personally, I don't need one on my ski, okay? I am not what I call an aggressive rider. I like speed, I like to go fast, sometimes I like to open that puppy up, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm an aggressive rider. It just means I like to go fast sometimes. But there's a different type of rider out there where they like to jump waves. 1 minute they're full throttle and all of a sudden they're letting go and now they're at 0, then they're back to full throttle again. That is a more aggressive driver than I am, or a more aggressive rider than I am. Those are the folks that just might want to consider getting a blow-off valve. Now, why is that the case? Let's take a look at that. Now let's take a look at what could happen if you're one of those really aggressive riders that I was talking about earlier. So you've got the throttle all the way in, or maybe most of the way in. Your supercharger is spinning, it's forcing that air down into your motor, and you're jumping waves. So you come off the top of this wave, you're in the air. Of course, you're probably not still hand fully on the throttle. You let go of the throttle, you're up in the air. So now all of a sudden you completely let go of the throttle. You've got all this compressed air here in this pathway going into the engine, but when you let go of the throttle, this throttle plate just slams shut. So all of this compressed air was just racing towards this throttle plate. It slams shut, which causes a backup in pressure all the way back up this pathway, all the way into your supercharger. So that hits the supercharger again, and that's going to want to cause the supercharger to stop spinning. But it's still connected to your motor, and the clutch is still engaged, at least for that 1 instant right there. So all this backup causes the supercharger to either slow down immensely, or possibly even it's trying to make it stop. And this clutch in here starts slipping. The motor's not stopping, it's turning. It's still turning that belt or that gear that's running the supercharger. The only thing that's got to give, or the only thing that can give, is that clutch itself. So now this supercharger wants to slow down immensely, or possibly even stop. The motor's still turning, which is still going to turn that belt or turn that gear. Your clutch is what takes the hit. The clutch slips because of those differences in speeds. And that's what could potentially wear out your clutch if you're constantly doing this over and over and over again. Okay, now I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, that's not a very good design. Why are we designing this part so it's just going to wear out so quickly? Well, one thing we have to understand is PWCs, jet skis, Sea-Doos, whatever you want to call them, they're actually not meant to be ridden that way. They're not designed to be ridden that way. As a matter of fact, if you actually look in the owner's manual, they recommend that you do not ride it that way. I know, that's just like telling somebody that just bought a brand new Hellcat Challenger that, oh, you got to make sure you pay attention to the speed limit. Make sure you don't speed. I get it. A lot of people, that's why they buy it. They want to ride that way. But I guess when you look at it, the manufacturers don't specifically design them to be ridden that way, so they feel that you don't need a blow-off valve. Personally, I don't ride that way. I don't need one. But there's a lot of people out there that do. So let's talk about what they do and how it solves this problem. A blow-off valve is simply installed into the air intake system before the throttle plate. So if you're an aggressive rider and you are jumping wake or kind of doing some of the things that I was talking about earlier, sure. So you're full throttle and you got all this air being rushed down or forced down through the air intake into the intake manifold. The throttle plate is wide open, so you got no problem. But all of a sudden, you just went airborne, you let go of the throttle, now it goes from 100% down to 0. This throttle plate suddenly slams shut. In this particular case, since you have a blow-off valve, rather than all of that compressed air kicking back up towards your supercharger, it now gets released through this valve. Okay, so what that's going to do is you don't have that air kicking back up to a supercharger. You don't have it putting that wear and tear on your clutch. It gets released through the valve and everything is okay. Simple as that. So I hope this has really helped you understand exactly what a blow-off valve does and whether or not you actually feel you need to have one. Please actually comment down below. Let me know if you have gotten one on your machine and if you think it actually makes a difference. If you don't have one and maybe you thought that you should have gotten one. I'd also like to hear from a lot of people as to if you've got a supercharged key and you've had to replace that clutch a couple times. I'd love to hear about that. Especially if you have a blow-off valve and you still find yourself having to replace a clutch. But like I said, I don't think I need one. I'm not an aggressive rider. I don't really ride in a manner that I think is going to wear the clutch out after a year. No problem so far. But you might be one of those folks where you feel you do need one. So let me know your thoughts. I do appreciate you watching the video. Thank you so much. Again, if you haven't already done so, please like, please subscribe, please share it with everybody else. And until next time, happy riding.